3, 2, 1, fire.
August 1945. An alliance of necessity between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union resulted in victory over the Axis powers in World War II. But victory set the stage for a new conflict. While America and its allies hoped to foster free market democracy, the Soviets were bent on spreading dictatorial communist ideology around the globe. The U.S. Navy played a pivotal role in winning this conflict, which would last for more than 4 decades and be known as the Cold War. Almost from the beginning, the Cold War forced Americans and the world to live daily with the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. Sometimes the Cold War turned hot, and Americans fought and died in defense of freedom. But their sacrifices ensured the survival of democracy, free market enterprise, basic human rights, and individual freedom for millions at home and abroad. With patience, intelligence, and steely resolve, America led the free world in containing the menace of Soviet power. The Cold War had many heroes, among them the men and women of the United States Navy and Marine Corps, who defended the non-communist world against nuclear attack. The Navy made critical contributions to ultimate victory. In times of crisis, the Navy stepped forward to help vulnerable allies fight against Soviet-backed invasions and insurgencies. For more than 40 years, tens of thousands of sailors and Marines braved armed conflict and dangerous duty over, under, and on the sea. Throughout the Cold War, the Navy's most vital role was to discourage the Soviet Union from launching a nuclear attack on America. Navy submarines, surface ships, and carrier aircraft armed with nuclear weapons performed this critical deterrence mission. The survival of millions of Americans and the nation itself depended on it. The Soviet forces that posed the greatest threat to the United States and its allies were nuclear-armed long-range bombers and both land-based and sea-based ballistic missiles. So Navy warships could operate for a long time far from home and in the depths of the world's oceans. Key naval leaders and the U.S. scientific industrial community put to sea advanced nuclear-powered submarines, aircraft carriers, and surface ships. Making all this possible was advanced technology that produced cutting-edge computers, sonars, radars, and communications gear. A worldwide, multidimensional, and robust naval intelligence establishment ably supported the Navy's overseas operations. One of the United States Navy's most vital missions during the Cold War was to ensure its dominance at sea. Control of the sea meant protecting American and Allied merchant ships on all the world's oceans. It also enabled the United States to support overseas allies and important international interests. American maritime superiority hindered the Soviet Union's use of the oceans to accomplish its aggressive policies. Throughout the 45-year conflict, U.S. and Soviet naval forces constantly probed and shadowed one another as they contested control of the seas. Sometimes Cold War tensions escalated to the brink of armed conflict, and American sea power was called upon to protect U.S. interests in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. One of President Harry S. Truman's first Cold War actions in response to aggressive Soviet behavior was to dispatch battleship USS Missouri to the eastern Mediterranean in 1946. In 1948, in violation of international agreements, the Soviets blocked land access to Berlin, hoping to starve the western portion of the city into submission. President Truman ordered a massive airlift, in which the Navy participated, of food and fuel that enabled the people of Berlin to remain free and frustrated Soviet intentions. In the Cuban Missile Crisis during 13 days of October 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union came as close as they ever would to nuclear war. When U.S. intelligence discovered that the Soviets were secretly putting nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from American shores, President Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of the island. The quarantine made it clear to Soviet Premier Nikita S. Khrushchev that his ploy would not work and gave diplomats much-needed time to work out a peaceful solution to the crisis. At the height of the standoff, the Soviets ordered their ships to turn around, and the world breathed easier. Embarrassed by their Navy's weakness during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviets poured enormous resources into warship construction during the next decades. Under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan, the U.S. Navy successfully countered this buildup with its maritime strategy and a technologically advanced 600-ship fleet. Projection of sea power ashore was also a vital Cold War responsibility for the U.S. Navy. Throughout the Cold War, naval amphibious forces stormed ashore and surface ships and carrier aircraft attacked hostile military targets. Another key responsibility of the U.S. Navy during the Cold War was to show the flag in areas of the globe vital to U.S. interest, discouraging potential aggressors and encouraging America's allies. Routinely, the U.S. Navy worked with the naval forces of allied nations to present a unified front against the threat posed by the communist world and to practice warfighting should deterrence fail. The President's mission also included humanitarian actions to help populations beset by communist invasions and insurgencies. Twice during the Cold War, in Korea and later in Vietnam, communist military forces launched outright attacks on America's friends. U.S. sailors and Marines were called on to fight against this communist aggression. Carrier planes fought the enemy for control of the skies, bombed their supply lines and air defenses, and attacked their forces locked in combat with American and Allied troops. Naval amphibious forces staged a masterful assault at Incheon, Korea, and kept the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on the defensive with amphibious raids and landings in South Vietnam. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and other combatants poured devastating fire on enemy forces within reach of their guns in Korea and along the coasts of North and South Vietnam. Surface ships, submarines, reconnaissance planes, and patrol vessels seized control of the coastal waters and denied the enemy use of the sea. Logistic ships and helicopters kept the fleet on the line and in the fight by supplying warships with fuel, ammunition, repair parts, food, and even the latest movies. Navy UDT Frogmen blew up enemy railroad tunnels in Korea, and SEAL commandos took the fight to the Viet Cong in the heart of South Vietnam's Mekong Delta. In Vietnam, River Patrol and River Assault Forces teamed up with Army troops and South Vietnamese sailors to wrest control of the country's waterways from the communists. American sailors suffered wounds in captivity, and many lost their lives in these deterrence, sea control, power projection, and presence missions throughout the long Cold War struggle. Navy corpsmen, doctors, and nurses saved the lives of thousands of Marines and sailors. Seabee units built bridges, established airfields, paved roadways, and constructed hundreds of combat bases. In Korea and in Vietnam, the United States showed that it would fight to defend allies and to preserve the values of democracy, free market enterprise, and the rights of the individual. For more than 4 decades, thousands of Navy men and women braved raging seas and dangerous skies and coped with harsh conditions from the Arctic to the tropics, far from home. Their service and sacrifice ensured there would be no nuclear attack on the United States and that the values held dear by Americans would endure. The men and women of the U.S. Navy held the line until the Soviet Union and its ideology collapsed from its own inherent flaws. America's sailors rose to President John F. Kennedy's challenge when he told the world
that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship to assure the survival and the success of liberty.